Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora koutou. Hello and welcome to Sigest. I'm your host, Hilary Ireland. Today on the Science Life for Me series, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Suzie Newman, Head of International Development at Plant and Food Research, which leads development of horticultural and seafood sector projects in South and Southeast Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. With a background in science and a career rooted firmly in partnerships, growth and commercialisation, Dr. Newman shows us how to elegantly weave science with impact. Dr. Suzie Newman, welcome to the podcast.
Kia ora, Hilary. It's wonderful to be here.
It's great to have you. There's a nice case study of your career on the Plant and Food Research website, which says you completed your PhD in post-harvest physiology at Massey University in Palmerston North. What made you decide to study plants?
So, Hilary, I always wanted to work in international development. And so I was kind of trying to think about what is the type of study that would lead me into that career. It's not like today when there's so many opportunities in international development in terms of study. And so the path that I chose was really to develop the skills in a technical speciality, and I thought post-harvest, it's an area which is really important in international development because there's losses right along the supply chain, and so there's real opportunities to come in and offer something that is of use. So it was really about, I guess, a means to the end. So I love science, I love post-harvest, but it was really about working in international development and what was the skill set that was going to take me there.
So why international development? What actually drew your attention there specifically?
I think it's just always been there as something that I really wanted to do. I kind of wanted to, as you kind of explore your options as a, if I'm trying to think in today's terms, but a sixth former back then, so year 12, what do you want to do? And you kind of go down a number of paths. But ultimately, I think what I really wanted to do was to do something that made a difference, that helped people's lives in developing countries, and thought that, you don't know all the answers at that point, but it was something that I wanted to explore. And so that is why I headed down that path. Almost feel like it was like a calling in some respects. But
a calling, right.
Yeah, I don't know why I was so set on what I wanted to do, but I really was.
There was no kind of major event going on in a developing country at the time that made you look outwards?
No, I don't think so. It was really kind of just as I was exploring what was possible. Oh. And where I would look to take my career.
That's super strategic. Well done for knowing that at such an early age. So can you explain to the listeners what post-harvest physiology science entails?
Yeah, so post-harvest, we like to say that it goes right across the supply chain, right? So it really starts on farm, and how do you produce a crop that is at its optimum quality and it's going to go through the supply chain and end up in good condition for the consumer, right? So It's everything from producing a high quality crop on farm, when to harvest that, and how to maintain that quality throughout the supply chain. So there's lots of different aspects to that. I was post-harvest physiologist, and I did my PhD actually with J. Waddy Foods, Heinz, kind of looking at improving the textural quality of canned apple slices, which you might go, that's a long way away from international development, but actually it made you start to think innovatively where you didn't have all the resources that we have in New Zealand to be able to store fruit, for example. And so you were looking at things like fruit coatings and how you managed the crop before it went into the processing cycle. Mm-hmm. So it was actually, you didn't have the resources that we had back then for fresh fruit exports, right? So It made you start thinking about what's possible.
Fascinating. So after your PhD, you moved to Australia. Why the move?
So at that point in time, I was like really wanting to get into international development, wasn't sure how to break in, and for whatever reason felt that there were more opportunities in Australia. I think as it played out, that was actually true back then, because they have specific agencies that really look at funding research for development projects, and so there was the potential to go into that. The other thing that I really wanted to do was, as an international development specialist, really wanted to broaden my skill set. So I've been really focused on post-harvest for my PhD, and it was an opportunity to broaden that, to work as a research horticulturalist, so working more on the production side on farm. I went to live in a town called Orange, which is about 360 kilometres northwest of Sydney, a small town, 38,000 people. And surprisingly, although it's called Orange, it is a major apple production site in New South Wales. And so it was really about being part of a team that had, physiology, pathology, entomology, and extension all within one team, and dealing with everything from research projects and leading those through to direct grower inquiries. So we were like on farm answering growers' questions. So it was really about broadening the skill set. Because I think for a career in international development, whilst you are often employed for your technical speciality, it's then also being able to be a generalist and be across all things.
That sounds like an interesting sort of tension to straddle, really, this generalist and specialist. How did you manage that?
Well, I did it for about 4 years, and then there was an opportunity within the Australian organisation I was working in to move back into post-harvest, and I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, it needs to be now. And so I did move back into post-harvest, and then from there, really, the opportunities in international development happened.
So how were you being introduced to international development in terms of the process required to do international development work?
So I think for me at that time, I'd expressed to my boss, who thankfully listened, that I really wanted to get into international development. And because I think she was happy with the way I was working and stuff, she made some introductions to a couple of other scientists that were working in that space. And they really mentored me in an international development role. They did lots of different things. One of them was very good at dropping you in the deep end. So I can remember my second trip to Vietnam, and we were just starting on this project. And the project lead in this case, he said, Suzie, I have to go and do this today. And it was some other review. And so I just had to go to the institution and do it myself, right? So it was like being dropped in the deep end. Now, if you ask my team today, I tend to have some of those tendencies too, in that I will ask people things on the spot to do things or drop them in the deep end too, because I think it is a really good way of testing and learning how to do things. And so he was obviously confident that I could go and do that meeting and get that relationship going and get the work underway. But at the time, it felt quite daunting.
Yes.
I think the other scientist that I was working closely with, he really showed me the skills about what it is to bring people together and how do you actually take a whole lot of different people that a whole lot of different skill sets and how do you pull them together. And I think that's probably been one of the strengths that I have in terms of, I like to call myself a bit of an integrator, so bringing people together, and that's something that's really necessary within an international development world.
Wow, sounds really cool. Lots of broad skill sets required there. And was there a lot of proposal writing, that sort of thing, needed to generate the funding for the work?
Yeah, so Hilary, proposal writing is a big part of international development work. Like, we like to think of all the exciting things out there in the field, but really it all does begin with the proposal. And often you're put into situations where you might go on like a 5-10 day design mission where you're designing a program for 4 years. So you have to really get across things really quickly. And so some of the skills working with both of those two scientists really taught me how to do that. So they would always give me, say, part of a proposal to write, and then that would go, Suzie, I think you need to lead this, and so then you take it on. So it's kind of that step-by-step kind of learning how to do the job until it's just something naturally that you do. So I'm really grateful to them for the way they mentored me.
Wow, it sounds like a great set of mentors. You mentioned you worked in Vietnam. You also moved to Vietnam while working for an Australian organisation. How did that come about?
So at that point in time, I was working fully in international development across an array of projects from kind of Southeast Asia and PNG. And there was another project within our organisation that was really struggling. And it was a high-profile project. So it hadn't come about by normal means. And so the funding provider actually asked my organisation if I would take that project on. And a lot of my colleagues said, whatever you do, do not take on this project, Suzie, because it is an absolute disaster.
Oh, no.
And you really don't want to do it. But I think the thing is that when a project has gone off the rails, that you can actually go in and you can break some rules in how you turn it around, right? Because all the institutions really just want to get it back on track. And so I had that flexibility, which was quite exciting. It was daunting. It was a big ask. It also meant a rearrangement of all my other projects. But the other thing that the funder specified was that I needed to be based in Vietnam. And so that was originally supposed to be for 1 year. And I ended up staying there 6.5. So clearly it was a model that worked. Like, I wasn't just working in Vietnam, but I was working in Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, and originally also back in Papua New Guinea, until one of my other colleagues took on that role on that particular project. So
is that 6.5 years working on the same project, or did it evolve?
So I was always working on multiple projects, probably around 5, typically at a time, across different countries. And that particular program, so we did turn it around.
Okay, good.
We were successful then in getting another phase of funding. And actually for that second phase of funding, we had the Australian Foreign Minister come and launch the program. So that was quite exciting.
Well, what an achievement. So exciting to have turned it around. And it sounds like you're not shy of a really hairy challenge. So good job. After Vietnam, you decided to move back to New Zealand to plant and food research. So what attracted you to the role here?
Yeah, so I was out of New Zealand for about 20 years. 6.5 years obviously in Vietnam, but the rest of that time in Australia within different roles. And I was at that point in my career where I was looking for a new challenge, and I saw this particular role to head up this international development unit, and I thought, you know how you read a job advert sometimes and you go, that really sounds like me. But wasn't really sure about plant and food, although I had worked for a predecessor DSIR straight after my honours degree. So I was kind of familiar with the organisation, but wasn't sure where it was today. And so I thought, maybe I should have a go at this. I wasn't sure at that time if I was ready to come out of the kind of project world, because essentially at that point in time I was managing projects across different places, and I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I thought maybe I am, and so let's give it a go. And I think what really attracted me to Plant and Food, obviously wonderful organisation, great science, but also the fact that the senior leadership team and board had really considered international development and where it was going, and did it have a future with Plant and Food. And obviously they decided it did, but then how were they going to equip Plant and Food research to do that at its best? So that's kind of what attracted me. It was also a time personally when my parents were kind of getting to that age where I also needed to think about a return to New Zealand, and so I was able to return to New Zealand and spend time with them before they both passed away. So
you mentioned plant and food research. We're considering how best to proceed with international development. So it suggests they were already doing a bit of international development work when you saw the role advertised. So what was the purpose of setting up the International Development Unit specifically?
Yeah, so Plant and Food Research had a really good reputation in international development, but we realised, I think, that it was a little bit different to the rest of the work that we do as an organisation. And so how do we best equip Plant and Food to be able to do that work? And so that is where they decided to form the International Development Unit. So initially, when we started, I felt like I was kind of in a startup in a big organisation, because I had 4 seconded scientists in the unit and myself. So these scientists had been working in international development, and so they were going to be 100% in international development. But what we were really missing was some of the other skills that are needed to deliver international development programs. So particularly around program management, social science, impact evaluation, and international development expertise. So understanding how to kind of take our science into a development context and make it successful. So I think that was where I focused on building. Also economics, because that's really important in a development context.
And why do you think it's important for New Zealand to be supporting international development in other countries?
I think it's really important that New Zealand supports international development in other countries because, we are part of the world. We're a long way away. We're a small country down the bottom of the world. And so I think we really need to have those connections in. But there's probably 3 reasons that I think New Zealand should really be involved in international development. So the first one is that we really need to be a good neighbour. And I think that's particularly relevant for our Pacific neighbourhood in which we are part of, right? If we think about the devastation that's happening as a result of climate change in the Pacific, where you start to see, there's islands disappearing, but there's like changes in climate. You're getting longer dry seasons, more intense wet seasons. You're starting to see saltwater inundation. And so there's some really complex challenges out there. And I think New Zealand scientists are well poised to address some of these. The second reason probably is the fact that we are a long way away from the rest of the world, and that we need to really engage with other countries in terms of trade. They need to know about us. They need to know, some of the places that we work in international development are also probably our likely markets of the future, right? And so that then kind of gives us more connection with those markets and to explore those markets. And some of our industries really want us to support them in supporting other industries offshore, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but actually recognizing that we are part of a global marketplace. And so how do we kind of make those trade opportunities open up? And the third, and probably one of the most important things, is that we learn a lot by doing this. And so if we think about biosecurity for New Zealand, often it's scientists that see things in other countries and then kind of explore how you can deal with that pest or disease, and that they can bring that knowledge back to New Zealand. And so that if we have that pest or disease come into New Zealand, then we'll know how to deal with it.
Wonderful. So let's dig into a little bit of the sort of work that you're doing when you're overseas. You seem to travel a lot. When you're overseas, what sort of work are you doing, and are you still getting into the science?
Yeah, so Hilary, you're right. I do travel a lot. I guess that's part of the role. And also, people hassle me about where I'm going to next. What do I do when I'm offshore? It's really about partnership development, looking at who our partners are and how we can develop those relationships. So it's about really making sure that we have good partnerships with our in-country partners, but also with the posts, so New Zealand offshore, like whether they're embassies or high commissions, and making sure that they're aware of us, what we're doing, how our program's going. And so those are some of the things that I do. The other key thing that I do is around design missions. So when we have new programs, is designing those programs together with our program managers and scientists. So those are the main two activities that I do when I'm offshore. In terms of am I still connected to the science, I get to see some really great science, but I don't get to do any of that science anymore. But it's fantastic still to see our scientists thinking differently and thinking about what are some of the ways that they can overcome some of the challenges that they see.
It must be quite a different proposition working on an international development project. I imagine some of the places must be quite rural, and there's presumably a language barrier most of the time. What, in your opinion, are the key skills needed for a scientist working in international development?
So the first thing I'd say is that scientists that get involved in these programs really love them. It's like they come back to us for more. So they really enjoy the work. So I think it's about that people are really driven to do these type of programs. In terms of what we look for, we take your science competency as a given. So that's kind of the starting point for working on an international development program. But then it's all those other skills that you need to have as well. And that's what we sometimes struggle to get across in terms of the types of skills that you need. So you need to be highly adaptable. You need to be able to kind of think on your feet and work out different solutions. You need to care about the whole. So I talked earlier about being an integrator, and it's really about bringing all those parts together. So you can't just focus on your science. You've got to see how your science fits into the whole program, and that you care about those other aspects as well. You do need to be culturally sensitive. It was interesting, yesterday we had some of our Tongan partners here, and we think about all the things around language and the like, but actually what they were challenging one of our program managers too is that you need to be across rugby and rugby league, right? Because that's really important to Tonga with the games coming up shortly. So I think there's all those types of things, and you need to be able to relate to people. You need to be prepared to go the extra mile. Because in international development, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It is one that takes up a lot of hours. And if you want to be really good at it, you really need to invest the time and invest in those relationships.
You mentioned the need to be highly adaptable, and in these rural settings. I suppose many of the scientists are coming from sort of high-tech laboratories or, field conditions in New Zealand and then going to these rural areas which might lack those things. Is there an element of MacGyver kind of innovation, creativity? Are there any examples where scientists have had to really think outside of the box when in these low-tech, potentially, environments?
Yes, I think we have seen some really good examples of that. One is in kind of virus detection and working out whether a virus was particularly present in the country, and the old methods that had been used were no longer detecting the virus. And so then obviously we did need to move to more high-tech solutions. But then I think the innovation is then that scientist was looking at, but actually people in the country need to be able to diagnose that. So how do we then make that high-tech solution easily achievable for the country? And so I think that's the really exciting part, is like that's just one example around virology, but it could be other examples where you're taking something that normally in New Zealand we would use a high-tech solution, but what can actually be done to be able to create something that is usable within that country. And so I think that's the kind of next step, but that it's still the best solution, right? We're not kind of giving an old solution, but it's something that is really suitable for that environment.
Very cool. You mentioned Tonga earlier, and I saw recently that you've been in Tonga and had to brief our Prime Minister on the work that Plant and Food Research is doing in the Pacific. You seem to meet a lot of very influential people in your travels. So how do you approach those important engagements? Are you ever nervous or apprehensive?
Depends on the scenario. Like, I think it's natural to be nervous and apprehensive about it, but the reality is that these people really do genuinely care. And so I think it is about finding those points of interest. So, for example, when I was actually briefing our Prime Minister, and I actually mentioned that for Plant and Food Research, I kind of tied the link to him being in our labs a couple of weeks earlier, so that, you've seen us in the lab and now you see us in the field, right? And that we're all one big organisation. And so I think it's about finding those links. And ultimately, people are people, right? And so it is just about, getting past your insecurities or fears and just relating to them as people.
Yeah, and an absolute building block of relationship management is remembering people's humanity. So what's the hardest project you've ever been a part of, and why was it hard?
I think there's a number of projects that have been quite challenging. I probably would say in some ways the hardest project was the one I mentioned earlier today.
Right.
Just because it was high profile, there were high expectations, there were timelines to turn it around. But often your hardest projects can become your most successful projects. And I think that has been true of that particular program. So why was that hard? There was a highly complex program. There were 7 Vietnamese institutions involved, 2 or 3 Australian institutions. You had about 40 staff that were working on the program. So it was about bringing all that together and meeting the expectations of the communities in which we were working and the governments who were funding that particular piece of work. So it was a lot of expectations, I think.
Were there any sort of key learnings from that complex project that were clear to you on how best to proceed with future projects?
I think it taught me how to deal with complexity and how to you have to be really solutions driven, right? And how you pull people together. I think it also taught me a lot about how to kind of break things down in a program and be able to create kind of sub projects within the project. But also to focus on what is really important, which is the impact of the work and how do we make that biggest impact and where do we then invest the resources to ensure we do that, but also to get everybody kind of on side and looking to achieve that together.
Wonderful. You mentioned the word impact, and it's been a little bit of a buzzword for, probably a decade now, long buzzword. So how do you quantify it? How do you measure it? What are you talking about when you're talking about impact for international development?
Wow, that's a complex question, but it is something we spend a lot of time thinking about. So as part of our designs, we need to come up with a results management framework to be able to kind of look at what are the key things that we want to deliver impact in. If I think about our recent Pacific design, there we were looking at delivering against an agricultural theory of change, plus then the climate finance theory of change, plus GEDC as well, which is gender equality, disability and social inclusion. So we were looking to develop a framework that actually addressed all of those.
Goodness, easy.
And so you kind of go across 5 countries, across 4 years, right? So how do you kind of break that down? And thankfully we have some wonderful people in our team who are really focused on impact. And so they started to work with the design team in terms of trying to work out what it was that we're actually trying to measure. So it could be, for example, it may just be a change in household income. It may be that you've overcome a major disease issue, right? So there could be a number of different indicators where you're measuring impact.
Wow. Wonderful. I mean, the scope of what you've just described is immense. Just as a sideline, how do you achieve all of that and, keep within project scope and budget?
I think you need to keep within project scope. You can always have scope creep within projects, right? So I think it's about keeping what is really important at the forefront. And I think that's what impact evaluation really does, right? It really teaches you to focus on those things and not to get sidetracked. Obviously, there's always things that come along in projects, and we're really lucky that people tend to be quite adaptive in the way these projects are managed. And so we can actually go into new areas. You can actually change the scope of the project, but you have to do that, obviously, with the funder to be able to do that. So I think that's also what's quite exciting, is that you can actually do that. You can make those changes, but you just have to go through the right process to do that.
Right. It's a really great lesson for all scientists, I think, is to have that impact in mind. Given that, you can come up with all sorts of different hypotheses and theories along the way that are all exciting to explore, but keeping that focus in mind is really important to keep things on track and make maximum impact. So fascinating. Just thinking about people who might be interested in venturing into a career in international development, do you have any advice for early career researchers, or maybe not scientists even, anyone who's early in their career who wants to venture into international development?
I think the thing I would say is just give it a go, right? So at Plant and Food Research, we often have the opportunity for a scientist to be on one of our projects, probably is where we would kind of start. Like the role can be specifically crafted to suit their skills, right, within that. So it's about having those conversations with our program managers. It's about having those conversations with lead scientists who work in the space about what the opportunity is. I would say that you should start early, right? It is quite a competitive space. And so, for example, in the Australian environment, people are often recruited straight out of masters to really focus on international development. I don't think we're quite there yet in New Zealand, but it is really about kind of looking at a career in international development. So it's about making sure that you have the right kind of core skills to be able to achieve that. But on the other side, I would just say have a go, right? Because if you don't enjoy it, you can find that out and move on to something else. So, yeah.
Yeah, great advice. So lastly, what is it about working in international development that really gets you up in the morning?
It really comes back to that making a difference and being able to do something that does actually make a difference. And whether it's like working with specific communities. So, for example, a few weeks ago, I was in Morale Sound in the Solomon Islands, which is quite a remote community. But you start to see that these communities, whilst they're facing incredible challenges, they're really still positive about the future, and that they can see that science can make a difference. So that's quite exciting. Or whether it's around kind of seeing scientists come into international development and really find that that's a space that they enjoy, and seeing them grow and develop, that really excites me as well. So for me, it is about the people. It's always been about the people. And so really, I think empowering people to make a difference. And ultimately, that makes a difference in people's communities and their science and their countries, and enables them to tackle the problems of the future. So I think that's kind of what gets me up in the morning.
It would get me up in the morning too. That's very inspirational. So it's been a real pleasure learning about your journey in international development this morning. Thanks for taking the time to share your story and your research, and we look forward to hearing more about the good work going on in the International Development Unit in future episodes. Thank you, Suzie.
Thank you.
And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered on SciGest, check out the episode pages on the Plant and Food Research website. Please also subscribe to the SciGest channel and rate and review each episode. Thank you, and mā te wā.